In this tutorial we'll look at the KeyframeGraph, which is the underlying method to control all animations within Mamba. As we saw in a previous tutorial, some effects like the color grade for example have their own bespoke controls, but they all sit on top of a keyframe graph, which we can access in single screen mode by clicking here, or in dual screen mode by clicking the keyframe graph button which is at the top of the screen. So when we use one of the overlay controls, all this is doing is populating values into the keyframe graph. So let's start with something a little simpler, just so we can see how the graph works. So I'm going to use a directional blur. And a directional blur just has two values, the amount of the blur and the direction it goes in. So I'm just going to reset by selecting the parent folder and press delete. So let's look at the curves. By default the graph will be mostly empty. In fact, there is a graph for the values here, they just have no keyframes on them and they're set at 0. By clicking an individual parameter, we can reveal their line on the graph. We'll see more of that later. To change a value in the graph, we can either click and edit a number, or we can drag. We can see in this instance that our line is going off the graph screen very quickly. So we can alter the scale of this graph quite quickly, either manually by clicking and dragging here, or we can select a parameter and say zoom reset, and the zoom will automatically correct itself to include all the parameters we've got selected. Zoom fit will enlarge the area around whatever we have selected. When we made a change, we can see a couple of things happen. The little green circle here indicates a keyframe has been added, and we can see the number change green here to say that we are on a keyframe value. If I move the playhead further away, we can see the number goes back to being blue. These two playheads are connected. We also see a green marker on here to indicate where the keyframe is for the given parameters we have selected. You'll notice that if I go further down the shot and make an alteration, the original keyframe is still changing. The reason for this is auto key is off. When auto key is off, it's assumed that the user doesn't want any dynamic animation, just wants to change the settings for the shot. So this is a method that allows you to park on a particular frame and make a setting that runs through the entire shot. Still with auto key off, if you really do want to put a keyframe here, then actually if you select the parameter that you want to add a keyframe for, you can either insert a point or just press insert on the keyboard, and that will insert a point on the graph that intersects the playhead. You can individually control the value of that keyframe by dragging on the graph. Because auto key is still off, if I were to make any drag adjustments on here, you can see it's offsetting the entire curve. If I put auto key on, then the adjustment is only made on that particular keyframe. And then still with auto key on, if I were to move to any other frame, making a change in value will automatically insert a keyframe. The graph will show all the parameters that are open on this side. So if I also insert some values for angle, we can see the two graphs being displayed. To work out which one's which, if we just click the parameter, we can see it highlights. We can also, with the parameter selected, press the keyboard shortcut H for hide, and that will hide that parameter from the graph. Shift H will bring it back. To reset parameter values, we could use this. Neutral point will insert a default value for that particular effect, which in this instance is 0. In most situations, neutral point is the transparent position of the effect. For example, if you were zooming in and out, it would be 100% zoom. If you want to clear a parameter from the graph completely and set it back to default, we can just select or select multiple parameters and hit the delete button. We can also use these as a source of cutting and copying. So on the amount, Control C, go to angle, Control V, and now we'll see we have two curves they're overlaying at the moment. So if I turn auto key off, this is now going to offset angle curve. Let's clear that away. There are different styles of keyframe. The default is a smooth keyframe that we'll find under points and smooth. Alternatively, we can turn it to sharp, or we can turn it to smooth tangents, which then allows the profile of the graph to be changed through the keyframe. Sharp tangents is similar, but allows us to break the tangent halfway. So we have different in and out profiles. Another type of keyframe is constant, shown by the arrow, where basically the parameter's value after the constant keyframe stays at a level, it doesn't animate to the next keyframe. So if I set the next keyframe to be constant as well and make a change, we can see that rather than animating down to this point, it simply holds and switches on the relevant keyframe. We can change multiple keyframes by selecting either with a left drag lasso, or we could select the whole curve and change the personalities of those keyframes. Where we want to create smooth starts and ends, there's a shortcut for that, which is once a point is set to be a smooth tangent, under curve, if we go to flat tangent, the tangent arms are leveled to ensure that we get a smooth start or end. Other things under curve are hide and reveal that we looked at before. We can also reverse a curve, i.e. play it backwards. We can flip a curve, which turns it upside down. In this particular effect, you can see the lines disappeared. That's basically telling me that for this particular effect, negative values aren't relevant, so the line disappears. Once I bring the curve back up into legal values, you can see the line reappears. Other option is to fit the curve to the length of the shot. Then there's also filter, which for each time you press filter will slightly smooth the curve a little more. It's also a nice shortcut if you want to get a keyframe on every frame, because pressing it once will give you a keyframe everywhere. I'm going to hit undo, Ctrl Z to get rid of that. Under block, we can create duplicates of sections of the curve. So for example, if I make a lasso selection of that and go duplicate and then drag, you can see I've got a duplicate set of keyframes. Under time are generally shuttle controls similar to these. For example, jumping between the control points, which is actually the same as jumping between the keyframes on this display. Then under scale, we can apply various operations to change the size and scale of our curves. Now these scales here only change the display. They're not changing the actual curve itself. Whereas these scales here are actually acting on the data of the curve. So scale H is actually just an offset, horizontal or vertical. Scale left and scale right scale a curve based on its position within a lassoed box. So if I scale to the left, you can see the leftmost keyframe is being scaled more than the rightmost keyframe, because the scale is proportional to the size of this box, where this is 0, no scaling at all, and this is maximum scaling. Of course, scale right is the opposite way around. Likewise, you have up and down. So this would be scaling with respect to the vertical height of the box, either from the lowest point or the highest point. Scale 0 scales with respect to the absolute 0 of the graph. So in extreme case, everything will get flattened down to 0. Under clipboard, we have our usual variety of copy and pasting. As we saw earlier, you can easily copy curves between different effects, even if the values themselves don't make any direct sense. For example, you could, if you wanted to, copy the X position curve from a framing tool into a blur node. The data itself is just numbers. It's not specifically tied to any particular effect. The copy frame allows you to take a specific value of the curve that's selected at the time, whether or not there's a keyframe there. So for example, to take the value from here and apply it later down in the curve here. Some effects permit multiple layers. For example, the color corrector has unlimited numbers of layers of color correction, and the Comp 3D DVE has an unlimited number of input planes. So this is where we would add extra layers, or duplicate or remove them, in which case other layers would appear here. Propagate allows us to take groups of parameters or individual parameters and send them to similar effects elsewhere in our layout. So as we mentioned, we can copy and paste values individually into other effects. This is a way of doing a mass copy. We could send this data to all the other similar nodes, or just the ones that we've selected. Under math, we can type in certain expressions, and the manual is best to go through a list of what's available. But for example, if we were to create an earthquake out of this, maybe we'd type rand, which is short for random, 10, which basically means create a number between 0 and 10, and whichever parameter is selected, that's where the curve will get sent, and then maybe random 360 for the angle. As I say, check the manual for the various expressions you can type in here. Then under Setup, we can apply various constraints and limits on what we're doing. For example, constraint X mean that now my points obviously are locked in the X plane or the Y plane. The limit X and Y basically enforces a limit on the graph parameters that match the logical limit of a given effect. For example, in this effect, the amount actually can't be negative. So you can see that I can't slide my effect down below 0. There might be some instances when you would want a curve to begin out of limits, in which case you can remove that limitation and allow yourself to put keyframes out of limits. SnapX just ensures that your keyframe placement lands on a frame, not in between frames, and AutoKey is a mirror of this. The AfterLast function allows you to insert a keyframe on what essentially would be the first frame of the next shot, as opposed to the last frame of the shot you're working on. There are some scenarios where you want your effect to keep going right until the next shot, and this allows you to place keyframes where that first frame of the next shot would appear. And finally, one other useful thing is if our graphs get very complicated and fiddly, there is a maximize button if you want to get into a lot finer detail.